So now we're going to conclude our look at Canto 17 in usury. As I mentioned before, this is more pertinent to us than we might think at first. And let's just see how this might be happening. And before I go on, I have to mention that I will be talking about the federal government, but I will not mention any sort of partisan concerns. First of all, I don't want to do that. This is a spiritual battle, not a political battle that we're talking about. And second of all, it's a cultural problem, really. It's not a problem of Republican or Democrat or Libertarian or what have you, but it is a cultural sin that we're dealing with. All these things are, and we swim in these sins, and sometimes we don't even realize that what's happening. So with that being, a recent report shares that 77% of American households have at least some type of debt. And the total personal debt of all U.S. households is $14.56 trillion. This comes from, as you can see, Dave Ramsey's website or blog. If you look, all right, let's take a little bit closer look at this debt. And we see that any debt is 14.56 trillion, as we said on the last slide, which comes out to about $54,000 per household. Credit card debt is 819 billion of that. Student loans, 1.56 trillion, so a lot of loans. Auto loans, 1.37 trillion, which is a lot of loan for a depreciating asset. And then mortgage loans, 10 trillion or thereabouts. And then we have other 419 billion. If you're wondering what the effect of COVID has been on all this, you can see that in this chart right here. You can see that credit card debt did go down 108 billion, but all the rest went up quite a bit, particularly mortgage debt, which went up $486 billion. And anyone who's paid attention to the state of housing right now and just the hot markets just about everywhere, well, probably not everywhere, but a lot of places, including Murray County, of course, you can imagine that this would be the case. According to one psychologist, and this is from a blog you see, to Pathos blog, and this is one person's look at things. According to one psychologist, up to 16 million Americans suffer from physical or emotional stress from consumer debt. It can lead to divorce, suicide, insomnia, anxiety, chronic headaches, stomach disorders, alcohol abuse, and contribute to heart disease. Well, that's a lot. This problem is found throughout the world. People tend to feel shame if they're in debt. Okay? In the United States, citizens have been conditioned to believe that if they haven't succeeded at living the American dream, it's their fault. Surveys show that 1 out of 3 families in the United States use credit cards to help cover basic living expenses. Perception that those in debt have been living the good life is incorrect. Illness, unemployment, and meeting daily needs place most in debt. It's legal in the United States to charge 79.9% interest on credit card. Not that happens that much, by the way, but it's apparently in some localities or some jurisdictions that could happen. But usury laws no longer exist. Some argue that it is a person's choice to have credit cards with interest at 18%, 21%, 29% or higher. There's a strong belief among many Christians that indebtedness is the fault of the individual. Christian Darwinian capitalist logic holds sway among many. And I think this person's got a point here, but I'm not so sure about this point right here. I think that's part of the problem right here is people tend to feel shame that they're in debt. I don't know if modern Americans do feel that way. I think we're somewhat conditioned to think that we should borrow money, and you can think about that and mull that over. But I think that's part of our problem and why we have a problem with the sins here in the seventh circle. Now we're going to continue with him. Honest reflection is needed as to whether Christians have permitted, condoned, or legitimized inherent flaws in the existing economic framework. Have Christians failed to be their brother and sister's keeper in the area of economy? Can an active love of God be complacent in the face of this form of economic injustice? Christian ethical models are needed to evaluate the policies and repercussions of loaning and charging interest. The meaning of corporate responsibility and good corporate citizenship must be discussed. Christians who work in the financial services industries need to be challenged with concerns about the rates and policies they set and justify. Are they being good Christians? Have they lost their way, and are their spiritual leaders showing them a better way? Consumer debt should be paid back at a fair interest rate. At the same time, though, no one should become a permanent revenue source through unjust gain. Christian ethics have failed in one of the most overlooked, if not ignored, civil and human rights issue in the world today. Although there are other forms of economic injustice needing to be acknowledged and addressed, this one is particularly onerous on the poor and working middle class. The exploitation should be included in any definition of social injustice. And this is something for us to mull over. Now, I've certainly heard in the Thursday class, I think it's in other people talk to me about this issue, that there's also a responsibility to borrow wisely, and that's certainly true. But the question also is our society such that it basically encourages not just borrowing, which is not a problem really in our economy, capitalist economy, but borrowing for frivolous or unnecessary reason. Now, we have talked about the private debt. Now we're going to go to something we think we all know about and sometimes fret about, and that's our corporate government indebtedness. Here we have a graph from the Federal Reserve of St. Louis, and this is the gross national income for the United States. Notice it's going up quite nicely, is it not? You can see in 1970 it was what, maybe $1 trillion, and now it's all the way up to say 23 trillion or such. Now, I'm not an economist, so I don't understand all this, but I do know that one of the apologies or justifications or reasonings about our increasing government debt is that, yes, it's going up, but so is the gross national income going up at the same rate. And as long as that goes on, that we should be fine. We shouldn't really be worrying about that as much. Well, let's take a look at another slide. This one is the look at the public debt of the federal government. Now, this is the part in blue. You see it's also going up, and you see this definite inflection point starting about not too long ago, where it's taken an even greater increase. And this green stuff here is intergovernmental holdings. If I understand the concept well enough, this is where the government borrows from itself. And it's also obligations such as Social Security and pensions. Now, if you go back and look at the previous chart and compare it to this, what's happening is that our public debt is going up now, particularly in recent times, faster than our annual income. And now we can see that our debt is about 28 trillion. And some sources, I think, say it's more like 29 trillion or so. I'm sorry for that black mark there. Well, and just parenthetically, you may be wondering why I'm using this little black marker instead of a laser pointer. Well, I can't get the laser pointer to work. That's another thing I've got to figure out in this presentation. Once I figure out one thing, something else comes up. So I'm using this little black marker, and just give me some feedback if it's distracting rather than helpful. I hope it's helpful. That's what I'm planning on being. All right, now to really emphasize this and really see this graphically, what I've just said, this is public debt as a percent of gross domestic product. Here on this bottom are the years, and you can't see it very well. I expanded this about as much as I can, and you can look at the web source here to look at the original. Perhaps you can expand it also, and you can see the years better. But basically, we got 1900 over here in 2016, so we don't have the latest, say, 5 years and the really dramatic increase over these last 5 years, but the trend is worrisome enough. All right, percent public debt as percent of gross domestic product. And if you recall, the apologists for borrowing a lot of money say, well, we're keeping pace, we're okay, because our income is keeping pace with our borrowing. Well, is it really? Now you see here in the early part of the century, it was not hardly much at all of our gross domestic product. In fact, red is federal. You see the local was actually perhaps even more than federal, and the state was minuscule. And that's, of course, state governments. Now, it went up here, right here, and this is World War I. And then you see local went up particularly as well as federal and state right here. And this is the Depression. And then right here is a big peak, and that's World War II. You see, after World War II, it gradually went down to about the 80s. And then it starts going up and down a little bit. And now all of a sudden it's marching inexorably, it seems, at least the last few decades, up and up to numbers perhaps not seen since World War II, and maybe beyond now, because I say we don't have the last 5 years. Now, let's turn to another issue, and that's public debt, and it's something we really should say we really need to think about and pray about. And we're all affected by that, and it's a culture in which we exist, and so to say, the cultural sea in which we swim, and that is a big issue there. All right, now we also have to consider that there's been a change to some degree, from say the time of Dante to now, what usury or the sin of usury really is all about. These guys were in the medieval times, if these guys are in hell, if they charged interest at all, that was considered sinful. Now, obviously, these days that's not the case. The Vatican has a bank even, and as far as I know, various church official church groups, dioceses, and Vatican itself puts its money in the various accounts to gain interest. Well, this is one way to look at it. This is kind of wordy, but nonetheless, it might be worthwhile thinking about. And you see the title of the article is "The Red Herring of Usury." And indeed, it is kind of a red herring. First of all, just trying to understand just what it's about, but also that it's used in various times and various places to say, well, the church changed its doctrine, had a doctrine against usury, and it's changed it. That means, does it not, that the church can change in other things, such as say, homosexual marriage or women priests or on and on and on. You can just get any doctrine would be, well, if you don't like it, maybe it'll change. But let's look a little bit, at least, a very complicated message here that I expect we need to be economists or something to totally understand what's going on. But I'll read it to you. Here we go. The New Catholic Encyclopedia elaborates on the technical definition of usury as it came to be used in the Middle Ages, and thus in the formal conciliar text of the Church. From the Latin usura, usury originally meant a charge for a loan of a fungible, that is, perishable, non-specific good, whose use consisted of its consumption. Such a loan was called a mutium. Money, considered to be consumed in the process of exchange for other goods, was classified as a fungible good. In other words, money was a consumable, not something that's perishable, permanent. And as a money loan became the most common form of loan of this type, usury came to signify a charge for use of money. Only after the repeal of the laws of prohibiting interest, usury in the above sense, and the establishment of legal rates, usury assumed its present meaning of a charge for money loan as exorbitant or exceeds the legal rate. So you see, we still have a definition of what a usurious use of money is and what would be a sinful interest rate, shall we say. As we have seen, money itself was considered barren, since there are only two illicit ways one could do with it: spend it, consume it, or hoard it. In other words, in the early Middle Ages, particularly, you didn't have investment banks or any way to invest money. The Catholic Encyclopedia explains money in the early Middle Ages was considered a fungible good, since once it was exchanged for other goods, its use ceased to exist for the borrower. In civil law, goods are considered fungible if one unit of them can replace any other unit, such as paying a debt. The term may be applied to things other than money, such as bushels of wheat or bales of cotton, provided that they may be used interchangeably as means of exchange and that their value is consumed by their use. One can lend money at interest, but in lending such money, the lender is guilty of usury. Apart from the risk of non-repayment, to take interest for money that you have no use for, but to hoard, was getting a breed of barren metal. It was taking up what you had not laid down. It was making a profit out of your neighbor's need or your neighbor's gain, where there was no corresponding need unsatisfied or gain forfeited on your part. But you see, obviously that's changed. Money is no longer just sitting around being hoarded. It's of other uses that are not being done if it's put in for a loan. As these ethical and economic principles became fully appreciated and as civilization progressed, it became clear that money in most modern economies, with competitive markets and almost unlimited opportunities for profitable, fruitful investment, did not suffer from the same tendency to be unfruitful as it had before. In the face of this change, the Church defined what is meant by usury. Session 10 of the Fifth Lateran Council, 1515, gave the exact meaning. For that is the real meaning of usury, when from its use a thing which produces nothing is applied to the acquiring of gain and profit without any work, any expense, or any risk. So too Pope Benedict XIV, and Pope Benedict XIV was in the 18th century, 1700s, his encyclica Vix Prevenit says the nature of the sin called usury has its proper place and origin in a loan contract, mutium. This financial contract between consenting parties demands by its very nature that one return to another only as much as he has received. The sin rests in the fact that sometimes the creditor desires more than he is given. Therefore, he contends some gain is owed him beyond that which he loaned. but any gain which exceeds the amount he gave is illicit and usurious. Note again that mudum is a loan of fungible, that is, perishable, non-specific good, whose use consisted of its consumption. That's from the New Catholic Encyclopedia. But at present, the choice of one's money in our world economy is never simply between spending and hoarding, for money can always be invested in any number of genuinely profitable, fruitful enterprises. And I hope you can see that changes how the approach must be to usury and loaning. We have a different type of economy altogether. There's much greater facility nowadays for making profitable investment of savings, and a true value, therefore, is always attached to the possession of money, as also to credit itself. A lender, during the whole time that the loan continues, deprives himself of a valuable thing, for the price of which he is compensated by the interest. It is right at the present day to permit interest, which is different from usury. Note, it's different from usury on money lent, as it was not wrong to condemn the practice at a time when it was more difficult to find profitable investments of money. Money is no longer a barren thing in itself, and thus the loan of money at interest is not usurious. Rickaby sums up the correct view of usury nicely. It is usury to take any interest at all upon the loan of a piece of property which A, is of no use except to be used up, spent, or consumed. B, is not wanted for a lender's own consumption within the period of the loan. And C, is lent upon security that obviates risk. D, is so lent that the lender forgoes no occasion of lawful gain by lending it. Now, with all this, we have this society of capitalism and such, and once again, there's some besetting sins of that. And this is a poem by Mary Oliver that one of my daughters, Sarah, pointed me to this poet. It's one of her favorite poets, and I found this in a collection of her Mary Oliver's poetry. And I think it's worthwhile to read in the context of what we're discussing. And here it goes. The title of it is Of the Empire. We will be known as a culture that feared death and adored power, that tried to vanquish insecurity for the few and cared little for the penury of the many. We will be known as a culture that taught and rewarded the amassing of things, that spoke little, if at all, about the quality of life for people, other people, for dogs, for rivers. All the world, in our eyes, they will say, was a commodity. And they will say that this structure was held together politically, which it was, and they will say also that our politics was no more than an apparatus to accommodate the feelings of the heart, and that the heart in those days was small and hard and full of meanness. Due to the advances in transportation, communications, and generally expanding economies, the nature of money itself has changed in the course of time. A loan that was usurious at one point in history due to the unfruitfulness of money is not usurious later when the development of competitive markets has changed the nature of money itself. But this is not a change of the Church's teaching on usury. Today, nearly all commercial transactions, including monetary loans at interest, do not qualify as usuries. This constitutes a change only in the nature of the financial transaction itself, not in the teaching of the Church on usury. Still, she maintains dogmatically that there is such a sin as usury, and what it is as defined in the Fifth Council of Lateran, which was in the early 16th century. And also we can see that even the New Testament talks a little bit, say favorably, about the idea of interest as opposed to usury. And this is from Luke chapter 19, verse 23. This is one of Jesus' parables. We have the guy who goes out, leaves, and he gives the talents. It's the parable of the talents. He gives talents to his various three servants, and one of them, the last one was only given one. He didn't just buried it. In other words, he hoarded it. And what does the master say? Why then didn't you put my money on deposit so that when I came back I could collect it with interest? And if you look at this same verse in the King James Version, wherefore thou gavest not thou my money into the bank, that at my coming I might have required mine own with usury. Well, it just sort of points out, I think here, that the King James Version is a version of the Bible that's centuries old, and you have to be careful with it because words and the words' meanings change. Now, once again, we have to look at some of the ramifications of this and this consideration of usury. And this is one from Catholic.com. Did the church change its stance on usury? When confronted by a papal decision they don't accept, teachings against contraception or ordination of women, for example, some Catholics say the church teaches that now, but it will change its stance, just like it did with usury. The Catholic Church's treatment of lending and interest must be situated in its broader context to be properly understood and to address the objection. Jesus said it's easier for a camel to go through the eye of a needle than for a rich man to enter the kingdom of God. In the 13th century, Thomas Aquinas made the same point in a less poetic fashion when he argued that the perfect happiness we all seek cannot be found in wealth because money is only a means to acquire other things, cannot satisfy all human desire, and is easily lost. Money, though a good, is not the greatest good, and the pursuit of money must always be subordinate to the good of the human family and the greater glory of God. Usury is condemned by the fathers of the church, including St. Ambrose, St. Jerome, St. Augustine, and Pope St. Leo the Great, characteristically in the context of taking advantage of the poor. Usury was also condemned at the Council of Elvira, the Council of Arles, and the First Council of Nicaea, all in the 4th century. All right. So now we've thought about this. We're going to continue on. We have another principle to consider in just a minute as we wrap up this Canto 17. And we continue. I found my guide already sitting high upon the back of that fierce animal, and that's great Geryon. And Virgil said, now take courage and be strong. From now on, we descend by stairs like these. Get up on front. I want to ride behind to be between you and the dangerous tail. And I would say that's a good idea. A man who fears the shivers of a fever coming on, his nails already dead of color, will tremble at the mere sight of a cool shade. I was that man when I heard his words, but then I felt those stabs of shame that make a servant brave before his valorous master. As I squirmed around on these enormous shoulders, I wanted to cry out, hold on to me! But I had no voice to second my desire. And see, here they are. See, there's the characteristically nice face, and you got on this monster. Doesn't look like fun. We continue with the canto. Then he who once before had helped me out when I was threatened to put his arms around me as soon as I was settled and held me tight. And then he cried, now Geryon, start moving. Descend with a gentle motion, circling wide. Remember, you are carrying living weight. Just as the boat slips back away from the shore, back slowly more and more, he left that pier. When he felt himself all clear in space, to where his breast had been had been, he swung his tail and stretched it undulating like an eel. As with his paws he gathered into the air. Another Phaeton feared more at the time he dropped the sun reins of his father's chariot and burned that streak of sky we see today. Or if poor Icarus did, feeling his sides unfeathering as the wax began to melt, his father shouting, "Wrong! Your course is wrong!" Then I had, when I felt myself in the air and saw on every side nothing but air. Only the beast I sat on was there. And I think one thing we have to remember is that 14th century people did not go in airplanes or helicopters or even balloons. So we have to give Dante credit for imagining flying like this. And the other point is he mentions two mythological figures, Phaeton and Icarus. Now, Phaeton may not be as obvious or well known to you. This fellow was the son of Apollo, the sun god, and he kept bugging his father for the keys to the chariot of the sun. Apollo rode this chariot, which was a sun, every day, and did a rational job and what have you. And so this teenager guy wanted the keys to the chariot, so to speak. And after being bugged a while, Apollo said, "Oh, all right." Well, it did not go well. Phaeton couldn't control the horses, and they were threatening to just burn up the earth. So eventually, the head of the gods, Jupiter or Zeus, depending on which you want to call him, had to kill Phaeton. And this happened after he dropped the sun reins because he just couldn't control the horses. And that streak of the sky that we see today is Milky Way. That's supposedly scorched that area of the sky, and it became the Milky Way. That's the legend. Now, also we know about Icarus. Icarus and his father Daedalus were flying, and Icarus got kind of cocky and flew too high, and his wings melt. Now, I have a movie coming up, a little clip that shows the legend of Icarus. I hope it plays on this. I'm about to find out, and I'd like your feedback to tell me if it does or doesn't. So here we go.
In mythological ancient Greece, soaring above Crete on wings made from wax and feathers, Icarus, the son of Daedalus, defied the laws of both man and nature. Ignoring the warnings of his father, he rose higher and higher. To witnesses on the ground, he looked like a god, and as he peered down from above, he felt like one too. But in mythological ancient Greece, the line that separated God from man was absolute, and the punishment for mortals who attempted to cross it was severe. Such was the case for Icarus and Daedalus. Years before Icarus was born, his father Daedalus was highly regarded as a genius inventor, craftsman, and sculptor in his homeland of Athens. He invented carpentry and all the tools used for it. He designed the first bathhouse and the first dance floor. He made sculptures so lifelike that Hercules mistook them for actual men. Though skilled and celebrated, Daedalus was egotistical and jealous. Worried that his nephew was a more skillful craftsman, Daedalus murdered him. As punishment, Daedalus was banished from Athens and made his way to Crete. Preceded by his storied reputation, Daedalus was welcomed with open arms by Crete's king Minos. There, acting as the palace technical advisor, Daedalus continued to push the boundaries. For the king's children, he made mechanically animated toys that seemed alive. He invented the ship's sail and mast, which gave humans control over the wind. With every creation, Daedalus challenged human limitations that had so far kept mortals separate from gods, until finally he broke right through. King Minos' wife, Pasiphae, had been cursed by the god Poseidon to fall in love with the king's prized bull. Under this spell, she asked Daedalus to help her seduce it. With characteristic audacity, he agreed. Daedalus constructed a hollow wooden cow, so realistic that it fooled the bull. With Pasiphae hiding inside Daedalus's creation, she conceived and gave birth to the half-human, half-bull Minotaur. This, of course, enraged the king, who blamed Daedalus for enabling such a horrible perversion of natural law. As punishment, Daedalus was forced to construct an inescapable labyrinth beneath the palace for the Minotaur. When it was finished, Minos then imprisoned Daedalus and his only son Icarus within the top of the tallest tower on the island, where they were to remain for the rest of their lives. But Daedalus was still a genius inventor. While observing the birds that circled his prison, the means for escape became clear. He and Icarus would fly away from their prison as only birds or gods could do. Using feathers from the flocks that perched on the tower and the wax from candles, Daedalus constructed 2 pairs of giant wings. As he strapped the wings to his son Icarus, he gave a warning. Flying too near the ocean would dampen the wings and make them too heavy to use. Flying too near the sun, the heat would melt the wax and the wings would disintegrate. In either case, they surely would die. Therefore, the key to their escape would be in keeping to the middle. With the instructions clear, both men leapt from the tower. They were the first mortals ever to fly. While Daedalus stayed carefully to the midway course, Icarus was overwhelmed with the ecstasy of flight and overcome with the feeling of divine power that came with it. Daedalus could only watch in horror as Icarus ascended higher and higher, powerless to change his son's dire fate. When the heat from the sun melted the wax on his wings, Icarus fell from the sky. Just as Daedalus had many times ignored the consequences of defying the natural laws of mortal men in the service of his ego, Icarus was also carried away by his own hubris. In the end, both men paid for their departure from the path of moderation dearly. Icarus with his life, and Daedalus with his regret.
Well, I hope that you could watch that clip. And one of the more important aspects of this is the fact this is a parable of Icarus defying natural law and showing hubris. And that has great application to our present society, I do believe. Well, let's look a bit at this commentator's talk about this particular point. And I have to say that if you look carefully at Dante, Dante is trying to make this point to us. He mentions more than once the issue of Icarus and Daedalus. And we'll see later on in the Inferno, when we get to Ulysses, also known as Odysseus, that he too is guilty of this problem of defying natural law and demonstrating human hubris. And we'll be talking about this point again, I believe it's Canto 27, I think. All right, here's this commentator's look. Dante heightens the Ovidian, remember Ovid was the Roman poet, description of Icarus' flight with a signature personal touch. The haunting and poignant words in direct discourse that Daedalus speaks to his son. Icarus, he said, where are you? In what region shall I seek you? Are modified by Dante, who gives him a moral edge. His father shouting to him, you are on the wrong path. The words that Dante invents are words of enormous resonance for Commedia, a poem constructed on the metaphor of the path. On the basis of the recurrence of the Daedalus Icarus story in the Commedia, remember, this is not the first and possibly not the last time we're going to see it, I suggest that, although Inferno 17 Dante identifies with Icarus, for him the key figure is the artifex, Daedalus. The artist's hubris in creating a method for flying ultimately takes precedence in Dante's imagination over Icarus's recklessness in the air. Daedalus will be evoked again in Inferno 29, again as artificer of flight. Here Dante coins the expression to be a Daedalus, by which he means to achieve the ability to fly. Hence, to make someone a Daedalus is to teach someone to fly and perch. Not make him a Daedalus means to fail to teach someone to fly. To be a Daedalus is to achieve a consummate mimesis that can transgress the boundaries between art and nature, permitting men to do what they were not endowed by nature to do. Daedalus for Dante is a transgressor of human technique, a mimetic genius par excellence. Once again, transgressing natural law. In these Ovidian similes of Inferno 17, Dante makes substantial his self-comparison to the great failed flyers of mythological antiquity. This is a group he simultaneously compares himself to and distances himself from. He fears he might be Phaeton or Icarus, but he knows, and hence we know, that he will not be. Dante's voyage is not destined to end in failure. And that's curious. He's haunted by these failed flyers into the unknown. We learn that Dante's journey is willed by God, from Virgil quoting Beatrice in Inferno 2, when Dante Pilgrim initially feared that his journey might be a folly, like that of Phaeton, like that of Icarus. Phaeton and Icarus are treated by Dante within the poetic economy of the Commedia as failed flyers who are avatars of his Ulysses. In Inferno 26, Dante will tell a personal version of the Ulysses myth that casts the Greek hero as a transgressor. The voyage of Dante's Ulysses is a mad flight that leads to his perdition. Dante borrows from classical mythology to construct a personal mythology. In his personal mythology, Dante uses Phaeton and Icarus as a template on which to construct Ulysses, who is his most important failed flyer, his most important example of transgression. Inferno 17 is saturated with mythological features whose hubris led to their failure. Hubris not only existential, as Phaeton and Icarus, but artistic, Arachne, and Daedalus. Geryone's adorned and colorful flanks are compared to in the early section of this canto to the fabrics worn by Turks and Tartars, and to the webs woven by skilled Avian artist weaver Arachne. Arachne would be cited as an example of artistic pride and consequent fall on the terrace of pride in Purgatorio 12. An Ovian account of Arachne's reckless pride in her art leads her to challenge the goddess Minerva to a contest. In describing the work of each contestant, Ovid emphasizes Arachne's mimetic accomplishment. The girl's woven art is such that not only does Europa seem to be looking back and calling to her companions on the shore, but an observer would believe that the bull and the sea were real, would think that both bull and waves were true. Enraged at the girl's success, the goddess transforms Arachne into a spider. Dante, emphasizing the perils of Arachne's creativity of the opera work that she recklessly made, depicts her in Purgatory 12 in mid-metamorphosis on the way to becoming a spider. Now, as I've mentioned several times before, this canto is more important than you might think at first glance, because it talks about a number of the besetting sins, perhaps of us, but certainly of our culture. And what we're just talking about is one of the besetting sins of our present culture, this hubris, this belief that there's no such thing as natural law or human nature or divine nature, that we can just simply, in a need or just in a whim, we can just transgress any boundaries that have been set for us, and that biology or nature or God or whatever cannot set any limits or boundaries to ourselves here. And these are two books that I think are very useful in trying to understand the background of our culture, and explains a lot of the problems we have, a lot of the secular issues that I think sometimes perplex Christians. Why is our culture acting this way? Why can't we even talk to people about God or certain moral issues? We just get blank looks or anger. Well, part of that is just simply this very point, that we've given up the notion that we have limits. We've given up the notion that there's natural laws. We've given up the notion that we have a nature, or even that God has a nature. And both of these books talk about that. First, here up is Brad S. Gregory, who is a professor of church history at the University of Notre Dame, and he's done a marvelous work in the teaching company. It's called the Protestant Reformations, and it's very good, very balanced, and very interesting. You can learn a lot. But he also wrote this book, The Unintended Reformation, how a religious reformation secularized society. And the emphasis is on unintended. It's not that the reformers wanted what happened to happen. And in fact, if Martin Luther or Zwingli or the others, Bucer, these guys came back and saw our society, they'd be horrified. But some of the factors that were set into motion just by this event created some unfortunate issues. And Brad S. Gregory is sometimes a little dense, and you have to give him a little time to develop his thought. But once he does, I think you'll be really amazed at how he ties in a lot of issues. The other book is The Rise and Triumph of the Modern Self by Carl R. Trueman. Carl L. Trueman was a professor at Princeton. He's at Grove City College, I believe now, and he is a member of the Orthodox Presbyterian Church, and needless to say, would have a slightly different view than Brad S. Gregory, but nonetheless, he addresses the problem in broadly similar fashion. But he also is concentrating on the sexual revolution. And you see the titles Cultural Amnesia, Expressive Individualism, and the Road to Sexual Revolution. So both of these books are well worth taking a look at. And just like Carl Trueman, you need to, just like Brad S. Gregory, you got to give Carl Trueman a little time to develop his ideas. And once he does, I haven't finished the book. I'm in the process of reading it, but I've seen him, once he gets through this, to really have some very cogent points. All right, now let us continue to the end here. He moved along slowly, of course it's Geryon, and swimming slowly descends a spiral path. But I know this only from the breeze ahead and one below. I hear now on my right the whirlpool roar with hideous sound beneath us on the ground. At this I stretched my neck to look below, but leaning out soon made me more afraid, for I heard moaning there and saw the flames. Trembling, I cowered back, tightening my legs. I saw then what I had not before, the spiral path of our descent to torment closing in on us. It's seen from every side. As a falcon on wing for many hours, having found no prey, and having seen no signal so that his falconer sighs, he falls already, descends worn out, circling 100 times instead of swooping down, settling at some distance from his master, perched in anger and disdain. So Geryon brought us down to the bottom at the foot of the jagged cliff, almost against it. And once he got our bodies off his back, he shot off like a shaft shot from a bowstring. All right, as a pilgrim prepares himself for the terrifying transition, yet further depths of evil, Virgil stresses that there is no avoiding the evil around him. In order to progress in this voyage, the pilgrim must himself henceforth utilize and come in contact with the monsters and guardians that he will meet. In this case, he must fly to the eighth circle on the back of the filthy effigy of fraud that is Geryon. Later, a giant will place him on the ice of Coctus. Most remarkably, he will have to climb on Lucifer's body in order to depart from hell. In other words, it's not enough for him to witness hell as an observer. The pilgrim must have his own personal encounter with evil. As Virgil said to him, speaking of clambering onto the Geryon and flying on a monster's back, from now on our descent is by this kind of stairs. Thus Dante must go to the heart of darkness within himself. I'll say that again. Dante must go to the heart of darkness within himself. And here he is, flying down to the heart of darkness within himself on Geryon. So, hopefully this was a intelligible, understandable presentation. Just give me some feedback. Let me know how it did and didn't go. Thank you.